The relay station at Kepler Drift Array 9 had been silent for most of its operational cycle, and that silence had become normal for technician Rylan Voss, who had been stationed there for almost 2 years. Deep space was supposed to feel empty and predictable and safe in its emptiness, because nothing important was ever supposed to reach this far beyond the established council lanes. That was the assumption, at least, and over time Rylan had learned to accept it as truth. Most days passed with background radiation, noise, and drifting signals from dead satellites and occasional debris echoes that meant nothing. Until the night, everything changed at 0317 station time, when a signal appeared that did not belong to any known registry or mapped origin. At first, it was faint and unstable, as if struggling to exist inside the channel itself. But then it repeated again and again, growing clearer with each transmission, like someone on the other side was refusing to let silence win. Rylan frowned and leaned closer, because signals like this were not supposed to exist beyond council-monitored space, and there were no colonies registered in that sector, and no trade routes or exploration missions scheduled anywhere near it. He opened the channel logs again to confirm what he was seeing, but the data refused to match anything in the database, which meant either something was wrong or something was very new, and neither option was comfortable. Then the audio came through, and everything else stopped. The voice was human, but broken and trembling and full of fear, in a way that made it hard to listen without feeling something tighten in the chest. It said they were being killed, and that it was not stopping, and that the council was not responding, and that they were running out of time, and that someone, anyone, had to hear them before it was too late. The message repeated fragments of panic and desperation, as if the sender was speaking while hiding or running or dying, and each second of it made the station feel colder. Rylan sat frozen for a moment, because this was not a drill, or a test signal, or a corrupted relay. This was real. He opened the attached data stream, and the video loaded slowly, as if space itself did not want it to be seen. The first image was a colony world, under siege. Entire cities were burning, under orbital bombardment from black-shaped warships hovering above the atmosphere like predators that had already decided the outcome. Energy weapons carved across the surface in precise patterns that did not look random, but controlled and intentional, like someone was cleaning a surface rather than destroying. A civilization. Civilians ran through streets, collapsing behind them, while structures disintegrated into dust and glass and fire. Then the soldiers appeared. They were not human. They moved with mechanical precision through the ruins, wearing heavy armored suits marked with angular insignia that matched no known galactic faction in the database. Their weapons were advanced and efficient, and their movements suggested discipline and experience in mass extermination. They did not appear to be fighting a war. They were executing a procedure. Systematic elimination. Sector by sector. Block by block. Rylan whispered the name that the system had tagged in the background data. Vakun Dominion. He had never heard it before, but the way the system flagged it suggested the council had. And worse than that, there was another line of text hidden in the metadata. Council response, pending review. Estimated delay, 72 hours. Rylan's hand tightened on the console, because 72 hours in a situation like this was not a delay. It was a death sentence, already written in administrative language. The message from the colony continued explaining that they had sent multiple distress calls already, and that the council had acknowledged them but had chosen to debate jurisdiction and procedure before action. The voice said they did not have time to wait for debate anymore, because the killing was already happening, and there would be nothing left to save if help arrived too late. Ryland stood up so fast his chair hit the ground behind him. His mind was racing because there was only one channel left that bypassed Council observation protocols, and it was not supposed to be used for anything short of extinction-level events involving human space. It was the emergency military relay tied directly to Earth's command, a channel that had not been activated in years. He initiated the sequence anyway. The signal locked immediately. Far away in Earth orbit, at Nemesis Station, the alarm system triggered across multiple decks and corridors, and deep within the command structure of human defense operations, a single priority alert reached its destination. Commander Alira Kane was already standing when the transmission arrived. She had been watching Earth rotate below through the observation glass, like she often did during quiet hours, because silence in space always felt temporary. When the alert appeared, she turned instantly, and the message opened across her console. Ryland Voss appeared on screen, pale and shaken, and unable to hide what he had just seen. He did not waste time explaining, beyond a single request for immediate viewing authorization of attached combat footage. Alira watched the video in complete silence. She did not interrupt it, and she did not look away, even when the footage became difficult to process. Cities burning, civilian collapse, orbital bombardment, systematic ground-clearing operations. And at the center of it all, an enemy designation repeating in military overlays. Varkun, Dominion. When the video ended, she closed her eyes for exactly 2 seconds. Not longer, not shorter. Then she opened them again and spoke with absolute calm. "Wake the fleet." The officer beside her hesitated and started to mention council restrictions and diplomatic protocols, but she cut him off without raising her voice. "I am not asking. Wake the fleet. All of it." Within minutes, Nemesis Station transformed from silence into controlled chaos as dormant human warships powered up across docking arrays and maintenance rings. Engines that had not been active in years came online one after another, as if waiting for this exact moment had been their only purpose. Every ship in the fleet carried the same design philosophy. Not expansion. Not conquest. Response. Alira walked onto the bridge of the Resolute Dawn and did not hesitate as she issued the next order. "Set course Outer Rim, Varkun territory." The tactical officer responded quietly that this action would violate Council law and trigger political consequences, but Alira only looked at him for a moment before answering. That law ended when civilians started dying without intervention. Then she said to prepare for a jump, and humanity moved. The entire fleet vanished into faster-than-light travel without announcement or permission or negotiation. And somewhere far across the galaxy, the Council detected something they had not expected. Humanity had left its borders and was heading directly into war. The human fleet arrived at the edge of the Varkun-controlled system without warning and without signal flare or diplomatic channel or hesitation. One moment, space was empty, and the next moment, dozens of human warships emerged from faster-than-light transition in a tight, coordinated formation that immediately shifted into tactical spread. The Varkun presence in orbit around the colony world was already established. 38 warships holding position like hunters circling a wounded animal, while below, on the surface, an entire civilization was being erased, one block at a time. Commander Threx stood on the bridge of the Obsidian Crown, watching the new arrivals appear on his tactical display, and for a moment he simply stared, because the identification tags did not match any known military power in the sector. Then he saw it. Human designation. He almost laughed. A smaller fleet. Outnumbered, out of jurisdiction. Entering a controlled extermination zone without permission from the Dominion. It was almost insulting in its simplicity. He straightened slowly and gave the order for interception formations to tighten. If these newcomers were here to interfere, then they would be made an example of quickly and publicly, so that the rest of the galaxy would understand consequences. He activated the communication channel himself. The human fleet responded immediately. Commander Illyra Kine appeared on screen without delay. No hesitation in her posture, no uncertainty in her eyes, just stillness. Threx spoke first, and informed her that she had entered Varkoon territory illegally, and that she was to withdraw or be destroyed. He made sure to include the phrase slowly and clearly, because that was the tradition. Give prey a chance to understand before it dies. Illyra did not respond immediately. She simply looked at him for a long moment, as if measuring something that was not worth measuring. Then she said one word. No. The channel closed. Threx blinked once, and then the confusion turned into anger, because he had expected fear, or negotiation, or at least hesitation. Instead, there was nothing. He ordered all ships to open fire. The Varkoon fleet unleashed a coordinated wave of plasma and energy beams across space that lit the orbit in bright, violent arcs, meant to overwhelm and erase anything caught in their path. It was a standard opening strike designed to break enemy formations before combat could even stabilize. But the human ships did not behave like anything the Varkoon had encountered before. They moved. Not evasively in the traditional sense, but in patterns that looked almost impossible to track. Ships accelerated and decelerated in ways that ignored expected inertia windows. Formations split and reformed instantly without breaking cohesion. Targeting systems struggled to lock onto anything long enough to maintain firing solutions. And when Varkoon weapons did connect, the impacts were absorbed and stabilized almost immediately, as human shielding systems adapted in real time. And the first human shot landed. It was not visible at first as a beam or pulse or energy wave. It was a kinetic impact event that arrived faster than most sensors could register. A Varkoon cruiser at the edge of formation simply stopped existing as a functional unit. Its shield collapsed for a fraction of a second, and in that fraction, a tungsten projectile, traveling at relativistic velocity, passed through it like it was not there at all. The ship ruptured internally and broke apart into expanding debris before the surrounding fleet even understood what had happened. Threx froze. He checked the readout again. One shot, one ship, gone. His tactical officer spoke quickly now, trying to reconcile the data with known physics, and failing. The human projectiles were not conventional kinetics. They were accelerated to velocities that should have been impossible for any known propulsion system without destabilizing the projectile itself. Yet they were stable, precise, controlled, and they were arriving in volleys. 3 more impacts followed almost instantly. 2 cruisers and a destroyer were disabled in sequence. Systems failing in cascading internal collapses that suggested the energy was not just penetrating hulls, but disrupting internal structure integrity at a molecular level. Threx felt something shift in his chest. Not fear yet, not fully, but something close enough to recognize later, he ordered. Return fire with full strength. The Varkoon fleet responded with sustained energy bombardment. Plasma beams stretched across space in overlapping grids designed to trap and destroy anything caught within their firing lanes. It was a tactic that had worked across 17 conquered systems. Nothing survived sustained Varkoon suppression fire. But the human ships were not staying in place long enough to be suppressed. They were moving through the battlefield like they belonged to a different set of rules. Not faster in bursts, but faster in decision cycles. They adjusted trajectory before targeting systems could fully lock. They used debris fields as cover and acceleration slings. They coordinated without visible command delay, as if every captain was reading the same mind. Threx watched in disbelief as a damaged human frigate lost its rear shielding under heavy fire, and instead of retreating, it turned directly toward a Varkoon battleship and accelerated. The collision was intentional. The impact destroyed both vessels in a violent expansion of plasma and debris that momentarily blinded nearby sensors. His tactical officer screamed that the humans were sacrificing their own ships willingly, and Threx could not understand it, because no species should fight like that. No rational military doctrine allowed self-destruction as a tactic. It violated every known survival model. But the humans did not seem constrained by those models. On the bridge of the Resolute Dawn, Commander Elira Kane watched the battle unfold without expression. She was tracking losses, not ignoring them, not minimizing them, recording them. Every human ship that fell was logged and marked and acknowledged because it mattered. But it did not stop the response. She gave a single order. Do not let them escape. Orbit the fleet tightened. The Varkoon formation began to break. At first it was subtle, a cruiser pulling back slightly, a destroyer attempting a retreat vector. Then another. Then the realization that the humans were not slowing down and were instead accelerating into pursuit. The battlefield shifted from engagement to collapse. Varkoon confidence dissolved into fragmentation as individual ships attempted to flee independently. Human ships pursued, not all at once, not chaotically, but efficiently. Each escape vector was cut off, each retreat path intercepted. The humans were not just winning the battle, they were controlling its geometry. Threx finally raised his voice and ordered full withdrawal, but by then, it was already too late. The system itself had become a net, with human ships positioned at every exit angle. On the surface below, civilians had stopped running. They were hiding in collapsed structures, listening to the sky change. The constant bombardment they had endured for days had shifted into something unfamiliar. Short bursts, sudden silence, then distant impacts that did not feel like planetary destruction anymore. One of them looked upward through broken roofing and whispered that someone was actually fighting for them. Above the atmosphere, the final phase of the battle began. Human ships closed the net, and the Varkoon fleet realized for the first time that they were not the hunters in this engagement. They were trapped prey in a system that had already been sealed. The Varkoon fleet was already breaking before they fully understood it. What had started as confident orbital dominance had collapsed into fragmented retreat patterns as ship after ship failed to maintain formation. Human vessels were everywhere at once. It felt like to them not because they were infinite, but because they were positioned with precision that removed every possible escape angle. Commander Threx stood on the bridge of the Obsidian Crown, watching his empire dissolve in real time. And for the first time since his rise through the Dominion ranks, he could not find an answer. Inside doctrine or training or history, he whispered that this was impossible, but the battlefield did not care what he believed. On the human flagship Resolute Dawn, Commander Elira Kane watched the final movements of the enemy fleet with the same calm she had shown since the beginning. There was no celebration in her expression, no satisfaction, no anger, only confirmation. Tactical systems were still marking targets, but the outcome was already locked. The Varkoon were no longer coordinating. They were surviving, and that shift always meant the same thing in human doctrine. End phase had begun. She gave the final order. Terminate remaining hostile vessels, and the human fleet executed it without hesitation. Escape routes were sealed instantly. Fleeing ships were intercepted by fast response units that moved in pairs and triads, cutting off vectors before they stabilized. The battlefield that had once been open space became a controlled enclosure. One by one, the remaining Varkoon ships were removed from the system, not through prolonged duels, but through decisive, overwhelming strikes that left no room for recovery or regrouping. On the surface, the colony world fell silent. The civilians, who had been hiding in ruins and underground shelters, slowly realized that the constant shaking of bombardment had stopped entirely. At first, they did not believe it. Silence in war zones was often temporary. But then the sky changed. Instead of streaks of energy fire, there were only drifting wreckage fragments, falling harmlessly into atmosphere and burning out long before reaching the ground. One of the survivors stepped outside a collapsed structure and looked up. For the first time in days, there were no Varkoon ships visible in orbit. Only human vessels, holding steady positions like guardians that had decided the sky itself belonged to them now. Above the atmosphere, Commander Threx's flagship took its final hits. Internal systems were failing in cascading sequence. Command structures collapsed. Power distribution broke down. The bridge shook violently as human kinetic impacts tore through layered armor that had once been considered nearly impenetrable. Threx fell to one knee as alarms screamed around him, and he finally understood something that no report had ever prepared him for. They had not lost to a stronger fleet. They had lost to a species that refused to lose at all. The final impact struck the obsidian crown at its core, and the ship split apart in a silent, expanding flash that lit the orbit of the entire planet for a brief moment, like a second sun, and then disappeared into debris. Silence followed. Then human confirmation channels opened across all surviving vessels. All hostile forces neutralized. Elera Kane stood still for a moment longer than necessary, as casualty reports updated in real time. Human losses were not zero. They never were. Ships had been destroyed during interception runs and sacrificial defensive maneuvers. Crews had been lost in moments of impact that could not be recovered from. But the objective had been achieved, and the colony was intact. She finally spoke. Begin surface deployment. Dropships descended through atmosphere in controlled formations, cutting through smoke layers and atmospheric turbulence until they reached the ruined surface below. Survivors expected more destruction. They expected occupation, or cleansing, or silence. What they saw instead were human landing craft, deploying medical teams and engineers and supply units with no weapon posture directed at them. Sergeant Nolan Reyes stepped out of the first dropcraft and immediately assessed the environment. Burned structures, collapsed roads, fractured terrain, and civilians emerging cautiously from hiding positions. He lowered his weapon slightly, but kept it ready, not for enemies, but for protection, because that was standard protocol. He raised his voice so it carried through the dust and smoke. We are here now. You are safe. A survivor holding a child asked, why, in broken translation and hesitation, because no one had ever arrived to save them before, and no one in their history had ever come after the attack began. Nolan answered simply, because you called for help, and we answered. Behind him, medics began triage operations. Engineers started clearing pathways and restoring basic infrastructure systems. Food and water distribution units were deployed. Human ships in orbit maintained full defensive coverage, ensuring no further hostile entry into the system was possible. The colony was no longer a battlefield. It was a protected zone. Far away in Council space, the reaction was chaos. Entire chambers filled with overlapping transmissions and emergency sessions. The Varkun Dominion fleet had been considered one of the most stable military powers in the galaxy, and it had been erased in a single engagement. Ambassador Sereth stood before the Council projection feeds, showing fragmented battlefield data, and he struggled to find words that matched what had happened. "They did not simply lose a battle," he said slowly. "They were removed from it entirely." Arguments erupted immediately. Some demanded human withdrawal. Others demanded classification as existential threat. Others demanded immediate diplomatic contact. But none of them could ignore the single fact repeating across every report. Humans had intervened without permission, and succeeded where Council delay had failed. And then a new signal entered the chamber. It was human. Commander Elira Kane appeared once again on every Council display across known space. Her expression was unchanged, but her voice carried something different now. Not anger, but finality. "This is not expansion," she said. "This is response. We received a distress call, and we acted." She paused for a moment. "If there are more calls like it, we will act again." The channel closed. Silence filled the Council chamber. Back on Earth orbit, Commander Morrison reviewed incoming data streams, showing multiple new distress signals arriving from across the galaxy. Hundreds at first, then thousands. Small civilizations, weak systems, isolated colonies, all requesting the same thing: protection. Earth was no longer hidden. It was no longer unknown. And it was no longer untouched. Elira stood in the observation deck, looking at the incoming data, and spoke quietly. "They are going to keep coming," Morrison replied without hesitation. "We can handle it." She nodded slightly. "Good. Then let them learn what it means when no one answers." And across the galaxy, the truth began to spread faster than any fleet could travel. When silence falls on a world, and no one comes to help the dying, humanity responds, and nothing remains the same after that.